Hey everyone, welcome back to Zilog and Moto, where after last week's dalliance with modern consoles, we're back to the friendly confines of the Genesis. To set up this week's review, I've got a question for you. What would happen if LucasArts, primarily a developer of point-and-click adventure games on the PC at this point, were to team with an action game publisher extraordinaire in Konami? Well, you get Zombies Ate My Neighbors. Or if you're in Europe or Australia, apparently it's just zombies. Horrid bit of censorship. Seriously, if they're going to be forced to change the name, they couldn't come up with something better than just zombies? What's next? Re-releasing Castlevania and calling it Vampires? Or Tiny Toon Adventures and calling it Bunnies? Anyway, beyond the naming issues, apparently the PAL version also had some other changes made to it, like replacing a chainsaw maniac with a murderous axe-wielding lumberjack. I really don't understand Europe sometimes. Anyway, based on all that, if you're not familiar with the game, you might guess that it's an early horror title, similar to Splatterhouse. And well, you'd be half right. But keep in mind we're dealing with LucasArts here, and I don't believe they've ever fully released an adult title. Although I could see an argument for Outlaws, a mostly forgotten Western first-person shooter from 1997. Zombies Ate My Neighbors is a horror-based title released in November of 1993, 2 months after the Super Nintendo version, but it's not like Splatterhouse. Instead, it's more of a lampoon on all sorts of classic horror movies with a humorous presentation that LucasArts was known for in their adventure games. And, in fact, there's even a hidden bonus level that references Day of the Tentacle that it actually fits in well with the rest of the game. So, the theme of the game is a spoof of horror movies, but what is the game actually like itself? Well, Zombies Ate My Neighbors is a top-down action title presented at a three-quarters viewpoint similar to perhaps a more detailed Gauntlet. An interesting note, and something I didn't realize when I started this review, was that this game was originally designed for the Super Nintendo. And then about halfway through development, it was decided to create the Genesis version as well. I'm not going to get into the discussion of the Genesis version versus the Super Nintendo version because, well, honestly, I really don't care. But if that's something you're interested in, Console Wars did a video about it a few years back that you might want to take a look at. Also, it should be noted that if you like Zombies Ate My Neighbors, the sequel, Ghoul Patrol, was only released on the Super Nintendo. However, note that I said if in that previous statement, for reasons I'll get into further on in the review. Zombies Ate My Neighbors, from a personal perspective, has a lot going for it. I'm a big fan of the old school LucasArts adventure games like Monkey Island and Sam & Max, and Konami's Genesis release list is pretty stellar. Almost always, if it's a 16-bit title and if it's from Konami or Capcom, you know it's going to be good. And I enjoy action games for the most part, especially ones with an original concept or take on the genre. However, keep in mind the following. This is a LucasArts developed title that is not a point-and-click game, and it's a Konami title that they didn't develop themselves. So it's not a slam dunk that this is going to be a good game. Okay, that's enough preamble. Let's take a look at the package. Okay, here is Zombies Ate My Neighbors. And as a quick note, this is one of the earlier games I remember picking up for the Genesis when I started collecting a few years back. I'd remembered playing it back in the day, so I was pretty excited to pick it up and add it to the collection. This is a pretty iconic cover with a reference to the old school B-style drive-in horror movies, so I recognized it as soon as I saw it on the shelf at the shop. The case is in pretty good shape, with no tears or scratches to the outer cover. However, the hang tab was removed pretty brutally. I think I might eventually try to sand that down so it doesn't look quite so awful. The inner cover is fully intact, with no edge wear, sun bleaching, or water damage. I love to see that. I love this artwork. It stands out, and you know exactly what game it is. The PAL cover, along with having the edited name of just Zombies, also has some pretty spectacularly awful hand-drawn art. Not really sure what they were thinking there, unless the censors wouldn't approve this cover due to the photo-based characters, but the US version is definitely the one to get all the way around. Flipping over to the rear, Konami laid everything out on a flat white background with black text, and that's okay, but this looks more like a magazine advertisement than a rear cover. The flavor text is pretty small, so you'll have to get up close to read it, but it does a good job of selling the game, and I like how it's got an off-kilter alignment for each of the sections, going along with the theme of the game being a little bit wacky. Also, all the screenshots are nice and colorful, with each representing a different style of level in the game, giving the game levels an appearance as being varied in style, which it is. But it's important for people to know that you're not just doing the same thing over and over for 55 levels. It probably would have been nice for them to be a bit bigger, like this one is here, but that's really nitpicking at this point. Opening up the box, you'll see the cartridge is in good shape and the manual in not quite as good shape. But this copy does have the warranty reply card with it, which is nice, and I like how it's got some red on it. Either some blood splatters to go along with the horror theme, or a zoomed in picture of the red hypnotic spiral from the cover. I think either are applicable. Moving on to the manual, it's not in horrible condition, but as you can see, both the corners on the edge of the cover are bent in a little bit. Before looking at the inside, I'm going to flip over to the back real quick, and if you notice, this is one of the games from when Konami's North American headquarters was slightly northeast of me in Buffalo Grove, and I think this, combined with the game coming from an American studio in LucasArts, is why it didn't get a Japanese release. There's not a ton of language in the game, but each of those level titles would have had to be translated, and more than likely some of those jokes in the titles wouldn't have made sense. Opening up the manual, it's of decent length. It's got an intro with some background to the game's story, which I always like to see. It gives the game more of a complete feel, especially in an action title, which is usually lacking on story. Moving on, the manual gives a breakdown of the titular neighbors you're trying to save from being eaten, and then a list of weapons and items you can find in the game to try to help you survive, with some limited details about what they do and who they might be effective against. I specified limited here because it really would be nice to have this explained in more detail rather than try to figure it out on the fly while you're running away from enemies, but I guess they felt like that should be part of the game. Finally, there's a page showcasing some of the major enemies you'll run into, and there's some obvious gags here, like naming the chainsaw guy Stanley Decker, or the doll Tommy instead of Chucky, but naming the Dracula Vlad Belmont? Come on, Konami, you're literally the Castlevania company. You know better. Anyway, let's move on to the review. Zombies Ate My Neighbors was released for the 16-bit consoles in late 1993. At this point, the 16-bit era was in full swing, and the 32-bit era was still at least a year away in Japan, much less the United States. Games for the Genesis and Super Nintendo were really starting to unlock the full potential of the consoles. And if you release a title that was either shovelware or just looking to make a quick buck off of a license, it really showed. Having said all that, Zombies Ate My Neighbors isn't a huge technical achievement from a graphical standpoint, especially from a company that brought us titles like Contra Hard Corps, Castlevania Bloodlines, or Rocket Knight Adventures. Now, granted, I know that's because LucasArts was the developer rather than Konami, so maybe that's not a totally fair statement, but LucasArts didn't exactly have a poor reputation as a developer either. I mentioned earlier when trying to describe the game that it played sort of like Gauntlet, and while I'm sure there's probably a better example out there of a gaming archetype to compare it to, I'm drawing a blank, so Gauntlet it is. But honestly, comparing it to an updated version of Gauntlet isn't that far off. Both games feature multiplayer, and while Zombies Ate My Neighbors doesn't support 4 players, it does support 2, characters named Zeke and Julie. They don't play differently, with one being faster or more powerful than the other, so who you play is limited to personal aesthetic preference. Once you've chosen a character, both games control in the same general manner, as you move the characters around from overhead, navigating various physical structures, but in Zombies Ate My Neighbors, you are no longer limited to some sort of nondescript dungeon, and instead explore various types of structures, both inside and out. Finally, both games have you collecting items, keys, and treasure as you explore the levels, with the eventual goal being to get to the exit door which magically transports you to the next level. But in the case of Zombies Ate My Neighbors, you have to rescue all neighbors in a level to make that door appear, adding a bit of nonlinearity to the proceedings. The best thing I can say about Zombies Ate My Neighbors graphically is that it's very colorful, and usually the scenes do have lots of small details. It's also nice how both the main characters look very different, and you're not just controlling generic palette-swapped hero number 1 and number 2. The actual level designs are well drawn, for the most part, and give each level an individual feel, or at least change enough from level to level to keep things interesting, because you will revisit levels with a similar background multiple times as you progress through the game. Along with the players, the in-game enemies are all animated pretty well, and they have a very unique design. You're not fighting entry-level zombies and then super zombies that are just a different color. Due to the way the game is designed, you will end up seeing a lot of the same type of enemies in a level, rather than a large mix, but that's just the nature of the levels, and shouldn't be looked at as a game being repetitive from a graphical perspective. And even in sections where there are numerous enemies on screen, the game engine always runs at a steady pace, with a smooth frame rate and no flickering. Just a quick note, the graphics in the game are one of the main differences between the Super NES version versus the Genesis version. Both games look similar at first, but the Genesis version has a smaller play area, and reserves the right side of the screen for player statistics, whereas the Super NES version has that information at the top of the screen overlaying the play area. Which version is better? Well, I think there can be arguments made on both sides, but after playing the game a bit on both versions, I definitely prefer the smaller play area and dedicated space for the statistics and neighbor radar. Yes, it's a bit of a drawback to see less on screen at one time, but having the stats floating over the game area is distracting, and there's a good chance you'll miss things that pop up behind them, giving you less of a chance to react. Moving on to the in-game sound, I've got to be honest, the music in Zombies Ate My Neighbors is pretty forgettable. It's not bad per se, but it doesn't do anything to stand out either. There's not a ton of background tracks, so you'll be hearing some of the same songs over and over, and each level's background music loops, so until you figure out how to save all your neighbors, get used to the same boring track for a few minutes. To be fully fair to the game's composer, I'm just coming off of playing Streets of Rage 4 from last week's review, with one of the better soundtracks you'll ever hear, so I'm sure my calibration might be a bit off. But I'm pretty confident in saying that, at least with the Genesis version of the game, there's a lot better out there on the console. I didn't play enough of the Super NES version to make a fair comparison here, but from what I played, the Super NES version definitely sounds a bit better, which is common in comparing FM versus PCM soundtracks. However, even with the music being slightly higher fidelity, the songs themselves are more or less the same, with a little spooky here and there to fit the theme of the game, but not much else there to make them stand out. The sound effects hold up a bit better. Each of the enemies have a unique sound effect to go along with their enemy type, and the same goes for the various weapons and items. Which makes sense, a squirt from your water gun to dispatch a zombie shouldn't sound the same as throwing a tomato. There are also various sound effects that correspond to the levels themselves, like when one of the stone slabs slam down in the temple, or a splash when you have to jump in the water. It's kind of odd, usually the sound effects in a game are somewhat ignored in place of the background music, but Zombies Ate My Neighbors definitely flips that script. The gameplay in Zombies Ate My Neighbors is problematic, and there's a definite learning curve to progressing through the game. From my earlier description comparing and contrasting the game to Gauntlet, from a simplistic standpoint, it's a basic overhead action shooter. Your character can move and shoot in 8 directions, although enemies tend to move directly up or down, so you'll probably get used to moving and shooting in the same manner. Also, getting your character lined up to hit an enemy is a bit tricky in the best of circumstances, so diagonal movement and attacks don't always end up being effective. You start the game with 3 lives, and 10 neighbors to rescue. The game continues until you have either lost all your lives or you have failed to rescue all your neighbors. Also, your neighbor count carries over from level to level, so if you exit a level with only 5 neighbors rescued, you start the next level with only 5. You can earn new neighbors every 40,000 points you score, but it's definitely in your best interest to try to save your neighbors as fast as you can, as it will usually take a few levels to earn that many points. As you progress through the game, you can also earn extra lives and find medkits, which are probably the most crucial item in the game, as every medkit you find will completely heal your character when used. That all sounds pretty straightforward, right? And it is, and if I'm being honest, I really like the concept of the game. It's original and humorous, but it also uses enough familiar elements to feel like an improved version of a game you already like. However, it's far from perfect. I like the idea of having a bunch of different items and weapons, and I don't mind the idea of needing to choose a different weapon depending on what you're going up against. Unfortunately, the control scheme is a bit lacking, and it's sometimes difficult to hit enemies, when it really shouldn't be.
It's hard to describe, but it's almost as if the game expects you to be perfectly precise, even though enemies just have to get close to hurt you. Also, sometimes I'm just confused by the game, and how it works or doesn't work. The jelly blobs that you first see in level 9 are supposed to be vulnerable to popsicles, and no, I don't know why. However, in playing through that level several times, I would frequently find blobs that would die right away, and then blobs that I could throw 5 popsicles at and still not die. So I would just run away. However, the developer's biggest sin, as it relates to gameplay, is how the buttons are configured. In a 6-button configuration, only 4 buttons are used. 1 button for shooting your weapon, 1 for using an item, and then 1 each for changing your weapon or item to the next in the list. What's the problem with that, you ask? Well, what happens when you're using one weapon on an enemy and then need to switch to another one quickly to take on another enemy type? For instance, switching back and forth between the water gun and soda cans for zombies and Tommy dogs. Well, if you're lucky, you'll hit the change weapon button an appropriate amount of times to make the switch. But more often than not, you'll accidentally go one past the weapon that you want, and then have to cycle through all the weapons again, all while you probably lost health or had neighbors killed because you couldn't attack quickly enough. There's 2 extra buttons just sitting there on the controller. And the system the game was originally designed for, the Super NES, has a 6-button controller out of the box. There's no excuse for not utilizing those 2 extra buttons to have a go back button for the weapons and items. This was a layup on LucasArts' part, and they blew it. I refuse to believe it didn't come up in testing either, so I'd really like to know what the hell happened. On an unrelated but an additional unforced error, you never know how many lives you have until a level is over, as there's no on-screen indicator. This is a smaller issue, to be sure, but how both of these relatively simple things weren't fixed in beta just blows my mind. LucasArts' inexperience with action games really shows. It's one thing to miss small details, but there is literally no bigger detail in an action game than how many lives you have. Finally, the game is too long. Or, to put it more appropriately, the game is too long for the save game system that was implemented. I like the fact that the game has 55 levels, especially in 1993. That's good bang for your buck. The problem is, the way the game is laid out, I have serious doubts about all but the most dedicated of gamers seeing all those levels without cheating. The reason for this is the save game system. Essentially, every 4 levels you're given a password to continue that's based on how many neighbors you still have alive. And that's it. If you have extra lives, medkits, keys, weapons, etc., all that is wiped out if you choose to restart and use the password. This makes getting through the later levels incredibly difficult without having that store of items. If you've ever played Doom and died on a level and had to restart without saving, it operates the same way. Anyone who's played Doom knows the more difficult levels are problematic at best with all your weapons, much less being stripped of them. My problem with Zombies Ate My Neighbors here is that this is all totally avoidable. Either come up with a more complex password system, or implement battery backup saves, which was commonplace by late 1993. Just like the other previously mentioned issues, it's an unfortunate design choice and really mars an otherwise great concept for a game. All in all, Zombies Ate My Neighbors is a cool idea that features some decent graphics and audio, but it's ultimately undone by avoidable issues. I think the game carries with it a sense of fun nostalgia, as I'm sure it was an enjoyable blockbuster weekend rental back in the day, but when you actually take a closer look at it, it's not as great as you probably remember. Because of that, I'm giving Zombies Ate My Neighbors 2 stars. But if you don't mind cheating or using save states, go ahead and give it a 3. I'm sure at some point I'll do just that, so I can finally see everything the game has to offer.
Okay, and that was Zombies Ate My Neighbors. A game with a seemingly can't-miss potential that is sadly just kind of average, and serves as an example as what can go wrong when a developer gets out of its comfort zone a bit. Tune in next week when I stick with the Genesis and get back into the racing genre. I looked at the schedule and I haven't done a racing game this season on any platform, so I figured it was high time to go ahead and get back behind the wheel. I haven't done much real-life driving recently, so it'll be interesting to see if that factors into the gameplay and my experience at all. Remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.